Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone's day going? Good? Awesome. Thanks for coming to this session. My name's Alex Carlyle, and today I'm going to talk about how I approach team alignment when communicating design direction. I'm going to start by giving an overview of my journey, and I'll describe the problem space as how I experienced it, what I was trying to achieve, the challenges that I met along the way. And then I'm going to go over some of the techniques that I use to overcome those challenges. I'll show some visual design solutions that I employ, and I'll take you through why they work, or at least why they work for me. I'll end by summing up some of my learnings, and I'll talk about some of the new problem spaces that I still want to try and overcome. I'm going to aim to have some time left at the end to answer any questions. If we run out of time for whatever reason, or if you prefer not to ask questions in front of anyone else, then I'll make sure that I'm available at the end of the talk, and you can come and have a chat, and I'll be around for the next couple of days as well, so feel free to come and grab me. So a little bit about my background. I've been working in the games industry for almost 20 years, from way back when I got my first break, and I thought it was the most awesome job in the world. And then I think I was told on my second day that I was about 3 months behind schedule, which was totally awesome. So onwards and upwards from there. All the way through to today, when I realise I'm going to mention working on things like PlayStation 2 titles, and that's going to make me seem really, really old. Much of my work has been on complex narrative projects, taking them from inception all the way through to completion, either as being part of a design team that's needing to support a vision, or leading that team and driving the vision. From those early Sony days to all the way through to working with Rockstar and Square Enix when I was at Kennedy Miller Mitchell, which is George Miller's production company, and more recently at Wargaming Sydney, maintaining team and stakeholder alignment has been a really key part of my job. Looking back at some of those games, The Getaway was really ambitious for its time. There were unique design challenges, such as like no in-game UI, no loading when transitioning from interior to exterior locations. We were blending gameplay into cinematics and back again, which was novel at the time. And there was a strong narrative told from two really different perspectives. LA Noire was its own beast. It was a genre-defining title. It was really difficult to find reference games. It had unique technology that was tied into gameplay with the motion scan facial capture system. It was an international development with studios in Sydney, several across the UK and a few in the US. And keeping everyone aligned and moving in the same direction and understanding what the pillars of those projects were was a real challenge. I've run my own company, Intuitive Game Studios, and I've spent some time in the education sector at AIE. Both of those roles were focused around giving opportunities to students and recent graduates, again in an environment where clear communication and alignment was key. I now head creative at Wargaming Sydney, where I oversee design, art, animation, UI and UX for multiple projects across the studio. And that's where I'm aiming to practice some of what I'm preaching today, very often with varying levels of success. Before tackling the problem space, I want to make a point that for me there's a need for a positive mindset that's both open to feedback and willing to listen to the perspective of others. Opening yourself up to feedback allows you to explore concepts that you might not have considered, and it allows you to interrogate your ideas to make sure that they are as strong as you actually believe them to be. And if, lo and behold, they're not quite as bulletproof as you might have first thought, I've totally never been there before, then the feedback might just present some of the options to help plug some of those gaps. And I also believe that game development is a team effort. That's been a running theme through some of the talks today. But it's important to keep in mind, when games get to the kind of scale that almost all AAA games are today, it's teams, not departments or even individuals, that lead to successful projects. And I want to stress these as kind of underlying assumptions, because what I'm aiming to communicate is how to bring a team on that journey and welcome their input. If I were to sum up what that problem space was, for me it'd be around communication. A core challenge facing a collaborative development is clearly communicating that vision. When considering the complexity of many games, the hurdle of ensuring that the vision and the design of the game is understood and hopefully inspiring should not be underestimated. The challenge doesn't only exist in one dimension, it's this kind of crazy multi-hierarchical beast, and it's all based around those different audiences that are consuming that information, from stakeholders, whether it's internal, management, publishers or marketing, to the team itself, and then even within the team, the different departments of that team, all whilst keeping the player's vision and experience in mind. When considering feedback, I mentioned previously that development is a team effort. Creating a forum that welcomes feedback is crucial for success. Feedback allows the team to contribute and empowers you as a creative to leverage the strengths of those around you. To facilitate that forum, there's a key challenge in making sure that the design is easy to consume. And lastly, alignment. Alignment's a fundamental necessity for any creative endeavor, any team-based creative endeavor. The team needs to pull in the same direction. By understanding the direction, the team's empowered to act, which removes the requirement of micromanaging the flow of information, and it reduces rework. Informed and aligned teams can mobilize into action and ultimately achieve great results. Today I'm going to talk about some of the solutions that I use and what led me to the way that I work today. And I want to call out this is by no means a silver bullet. This method of communication, it works for me, and I'm still always looking to improve it. And also, ultimately, every team is different, so what works in my scenario might not translate to yours. For context, today I'm going to be using Noire as my case study. I can't share some of the unannounced projects that we're working on at Wargaming, but also a lot of the motivation for the way I work today came from many of the challenges that I faced whilst leading the design of Noire. The techniques I use today I didn't have during the development of Noire, so with full disclosure, I've kind of retroactively created them for the purposes of this presentation. For those that don't know what that game was, it was a pseudo-open world detective thriller set in 1940s Los Angeles. It was developed by Team Bondi, and it was published by Rockstar Games. Noire embodied all of the challenges that I spoke about previously, and then some. It was highly complex and a lengthy development. It had teams distributed around the world. The global team size was around 300 people. The promise, the promise of the facial technology, which kind of formed the backbone of the interrogation system, was unknown and untested for a really long time during development. So keeping the team informed, inspired and aligned to what we were making was incredibly difficult. The team grew rapidly and features changed hands. So onboarding new people and ensuring that existing team members knew what they needed to know to do their job was very difficult. On the previous slide, I slipped in that word inspired. Knowing what to do, or where to go is crucial. But without being excited about that direction, without that kind of tantalizing feeling that you're working on something truly amazing, the team can be left feeling a bit lost. Noire was an incredibly long development, as I mentioned. It was 7 years, for those that don't know. In retrospect, I felt that the flow of communication about what we were making really impacted the ability of those to inspire the team when the development really began to feel like it was dragging. And it's even more of a problem when you're working on titles that are distributed multi-site around the world. We're all passionate people who are intrinsically motivated to create something awesome, both for ourselves as developers, but also as gamers. As someone who's involved in creative work, I believe we aim to inspire. We want to get people excited. The team we're working with day to day, our stakeholders who are invested in what we're making, and ultimately the players who are going to end up exploring these experiences that we create. Inspiration's a real motivating factor. Having the team mentally stimulated allows them to do something creative. It's really important, therefore, to consider how we're communicating our visions and what those visions are. Accessibility to that information is critical for the team and the project to be successful. Really sorry, my throat's going. For me, vision represents that North Star for the team. Having a clear vision that's well articulated and understood is the foundation for achieving alignment. It's easy to think of vision as a statement, a subset of goals or pillars, or even an Avenger. But vision can be something that extends beyond that and informs all decisions being made on a project. For me, it's the boundaries or limits within which the game exists. Our aim as creative leaders should be to continually define a better, more accurate set of constraints or boundaries. Defining the vision, incorporating feedback, shaping the development of a project through iteration are all steps on the journey of defining a focused set of constraints, a guiding force for the team to work within. So, thinking back to my time on LA Noire, when I was approaching the challenge of communicating the vision of the project, what the player was going to be doing, how they'd progress through the game, what did I do? Well, I'm a designer, so I leveraged my tradecraft and I wrote stuff down. Unsurprisingly, I was going to create a game design document, a Bible by which the team could understand what we were making. And in this case, it was going to be a document so beautifully crafted that it would inspire every reader to make the best game ever made. This was obviously before the team exploded in size, development grew completely out of control, and generally everything went to shit. So, could a document save the day? Jesse Schell, in his book, The Art of Game Design, postulated that the game design document was created to solve two main issues: memory and communication. As games scale and grow more complex, documenting what needs to be done is necessary to ensure we don't lose sight of what we said we were going to do. And the process of documenting allows those choices to be shared, satisfying both memory and communication. His diagram shows not only the potential relationships between those groups, but also highlights that each group could be generating their own form of documentation: design, writing GDDs and design overviews, engineering, creating technical design documents and pipeline documents, writing with scripts and stories, and management owning budgets and schedules. That was definitely true of LA Noire. But what this diagram also helps me remember is that documentation is consumed by all of these different departments, and their needs are very different. When using this diagram to assist myself in thinking of those different consumers of information, I also add in a few different other groups. Teams like UX teams, publishing and marketing. Now, if you recall from my previous slide, my aim was to create the most eloquent game design document ever made, and hopefully satisfy all these audiences in one go, the one design document to rule them all. Enter the LA Noire game design document. This was an early version, so it definitely wasn't the final one. It was A3 in size, for those that can't see the scope, and it was about 155 pages long, with something like a size 10 font. I remember an early version having over 36,000 words. There are many positives to these kind of documents, and in some cases there's actual contractual obligations. Publishers, for example, often want to know that you've got some idea of what the hell you're going to make and what they're paying for. But also as a designer, when crafting a game design document, it's a really useful tool to make you consider the details of a mechanic and how it relates to the other mechanics. And I want to be clear, I'd still use documentation. I haven't set fire to it all. But I use it to create a variety of different kinds of documents of varying scope and always considering for different audiences. But for a moment, let's go back to what this talk is all about. Communicating design and vision, encouraging feedback, and aligning teams. Now, for me, the LA Noire game design document was a work of art. It's beautiful. And I was really proud of the work that went into this. And I expected everyone to love it. But taking my designer hat off for a second, there was no denying it was brutal to consume. It was hard to maintain and keep up to date. It delved into details very quickly, which was kind of its purpose. But again, remembering that there are different audiences for information, and not everyone needs to read all the details of everything to do their job well. And after doing this awesome piece of information, I learned some other things about how people consume information effectively. Humans respond to and process visual data better than any other type of data. The human brain processes images 60,000 times faster than text, and 90% of the information that's transmitted to the brain is visual. If you consider that visual data isn't only easier to consume, but it can also alleviate miscommunication. Greg Donovan from Volition had a great example of this, which I've borrowed for the sake of this presentation. And that's that if you give 3 different designers a brief of, we need a rock, you get everything from someone creating a stone, potentially for a weapon. There'll be a designer that will go next level and create some kind of iconic landmark. And there's always going to be some smart person that gives you Dwayne Johnson. I spend a lot of time on LA Noire fielding questions from the team, which is fine. That's kind of part of my job. But when digging into why, it was because the game design document was incredibly hard to consume. It was intimidating to read, so people didn't. And if they did, they certainly didn't want to go back and reread it once it had been updated. And knowing what was new was really hard to navigate, which, as I already mentioned, keeping it up to date was also not a walk in the park either. To get a solid understanding of the game, you kind of needed to read the majority of the document. Because the document itself was less accessible just by pure virtue of its scale, it meant that feedback was less present from the team, at least until the point where we started to implement features. And at that point, iterating is more costly than if it had been done earlier in the design process. And as Dwayne here can back me up, there was a high chance of misinterpreting what was written. There had to be a better way, something that provided the detail when needed, but where we could give the team a better overview of the game vision in a more easily accessible format. So that's what I started to explore when I moved from Team Bondi to work with Warners at Kennedy Miller Mitchell. After LA Noire, I wanted a better way to visualize and share an overview of the game. There were 2 really amazing guys, Troy Skinner and Lowell Vaughan, and they were both working with the Warners usability group at the time. And they put me onto something that they were using, which is a diagram that was aimed to describe a game through the player's activities and areas of growth or progression. And to me, this seemed like a really good place to start. So I began working on what became an interaction map. So if I walk you through this example, this is LA Noire through the lens of the player journey. There's a narrative track, assigned cases and street crimes, which we internally called unassigned cases. It shows the desks that the player would be working through. So cases were broken up into a series of separate police desks. You'd start with patrol and work your way through to arson. And progressing through that, you would unlock things such as new weapons or player outfits, and some of those would provide buffs to the player, such as increased ammo limits or better combat effectiveness. There are collectibles in the form of police badges, film reels, records, and novels. And there are landmarks and new vehicles to discover, and newspapers which triggered cutscenes explaining some of the backstory behind LA Noir's narrative. There's a little bit there which is doing an experience overview, which is just illustrating that there's a rating level for completing cases, a rank that players can level up to, and intuition points which you can unlock, which you can use in the interrogation mechanic. All of this is contained in one simple image. There's also opportunities to add in subtle information to this kind of diagram. If you've got a particular style that suits your game or setting, you can add in that detail, whether it's a font choice or background images. So as a quick example, and it's not a particularly great one, but for speed, what I've done is I've used a 1940s color palette in this to ground that diagram in the period that the game was set. You can play around with how far you want to take that. In terms of software, I just built this straight into PowerPoint for today, but originally I was playing around with Photoshop and InDesign, which was a bit cumbersome, but it was manageable. I still use interaction maps today, but for me they're mostly a starting point. But it didn't quite convey enough information to the team for me, so I wanted to explore further ways to iterate on that. So that became this, which is a game canvas. Don't worry if you're not able to see all of the elements. I'll go over the sections in future slides. The game canvas has more detail than the interaction map, and wherever possible, it leverages the lessons learned from communicating visually to lessen the ambiguity that comes with documentation alone. In exploring this kind of diagram, I found that there's actually software built specifically for this job, which is Visio, and that's what I still use today. I took some inspiration for this from Ubisoft, who use similar diagrams. They call them scope posters. They use them to track what's going into particular milestones. Volition also use something which they call a product canvas, and that's based on Alexander Ostwalder's business canvas. So there's a lot of other people also playing around with different things like this. The way I approach the canvas is a series of elements that I'm trying to communicate. There's no hard and fast rules about what elements you want to include, but in the LA Noire example up there, I've added progression, I've covered something about the map, and I'm looking at some of the important features that I want to try and communicate. I've kept the rank stuff that I had before, and I've added a gameplay loop. This approach really altered the way we worked at Kennedy Miller Mitchell. I didn't abandon traditional design documentation, but instead of writing a single huge one document to rule them all, I broke them down into smaller feature specifications, which we kept on a wiki for easy access and much better tracking of changes. It also allowed that work to be distributed more easily, so members of the design team or feature teams could own a particular area. I used the canvas to give that overview of the game, and I had them printed on really large posters and put around the office. And that allowed the team to see what the game was as part of their normal daily activities. And this moved us towards my goals of improving communication, getting people more access to the design, and making that information accessible, which in turn allowed for more feedback and improved team alignment. So this is the progression part, and for me this was the most important element. I can show the narrative progression for the player, and I can tie in key content to that timeline. On this particular slide, I've cut out the middle few desks just so I could get it a bit bigger, so hopefully you can see it. So it's only showing patrol traffic, and then it jumps straight to arson. So looking at this, I can include things like the case names. That adds color, but it also lets people know what cases are what and gets them familiar with what's happening in the game. I can also show which player character is being used and on which case. I can show which of the police stations the player is based out of, which lets the team know which areas of the map are being used and when, and that's the jurisdiction line at the top, Wilshire Central and Hollywood. I can show where the newspapers are located in respect to the cases to show where we expect the players to interact with the backstory narrative. And I don't just say that there are street crimes, but I can actually show where they're unlocked and made available to the player, which is the bottom line of numbers. With the interaction map, I could only show that there were collectibles. Here I can actually visualize the game world, giving the team an idea of that whole playable environment, as well as the locations of those collectibles. From a design perspective, this was a really useful tool just in planning a decent distribution of collectibles around the game world. When doing this as part of the design process, it's really useful. When doing it for a presentation 8 years after the game was released, I can't tell you how much of a pain in the ass it was trying to find out where all those locations were. When we looked at the interaction map earlier, I mentioned that through playing the cases, there were outfits that could be unlocked. Here I can show what they actually look like visually. There's a secondary benefit to this, in that, well, there's a few. One in that, again, it's a way that you can tie people into the game and the period and the setting. But it's also a way of celebrating the work. There are a lot of artists and character artists that built this stuff, and having it displayed is a great way of getting buy-in and making the team understand it's a team effort. We can also, in this, describe what those bonuses and buffs do and link them to the right outfits, so you get a much better understanding of what you were doing. I could have gone a step further if I thought it was important and shown which outfit was unlocked by which case or which activity, but I've not done that here. The other thing I did choose to do, though, was add in the images of the partner characters, because they were a really important narrative device in the game, so they deserved a spot. In the same way I had case ratings, player levels, and intuition points, I've repeated that information in the game canvas. I've got a little bit more information in terms of the way cases can be rated and to what level, from 1 star through to 5 stars. I'm also adding in a gameplay loop for how the interrogation system works. And I'd really encourage putting as many of those into your game canvases as possible. I found gameplay loops to be particularly useful to visualize and describe the gameplay to the team. The game canvas can be as large as you want it to be, and it can show pretty much whatever you need it to show. That's part of the challenge, identifying what is important to convey to the team. And the only real restrictions are in how you intend to display it. If you're going to share it digitally, then you can make it as big as you like. If you're going to go to the effort of having them printed, then you might want to consider how you break it up into printable documents, but there's nothing stopping you from having multiple. In the context of LA Noire, if we'd had something like a game canvas, I believe it would have really provided that missing high-level overview of what the project was on a day-to-day basis. The teams working on the cases, for example, being able to visualize the order of those cases and understanding what information had come before the ones that they were working on would have been really useful. There are other crazy things, like the code team would have known things like where the player was likely to be at different points in the game, which would have been really useful when tackling problems like deciding to do an Xbox build really late in the development and realizing your game now had to be split across multiple disks. The story department would have had an easier visualization of where those narratives were intersecting as well. If I were to have the opportunity of leveraging this method of communicating on a game like LA Noire again, a do-over if you like, there's probably a few additional things that I would consider doing. Thinking back to some of the key challenges that the cases teams had, I can see real value in a canvas per case. Now that would have been 22 main case canvases and potentially another 4 if you were going to do the patrol desk. And while that would have been a lot of work, I can remember issues of things like the art team really struggling to know how much of a location to build, where the player was going to go, where were the clues going to be positioned, where were the interrogations going to take place, how could they think about camera positioning and set dressing, props team needing to know what clues to build and what general objects needed to be created. We managed all of that with case overview documents, but as we've discussed, this relied on everyone reading pages of documentation, and it was hard to get that high-level picture that what went into a case from just a single document. A lot of iteration ended up happening once the case was roughed out in gameplay, which is great and to be expected, and I'm certainly not against playtesting and iterating. But again, it would have been more efficient to catch some of those earlier difficulties with a better way of visualizing the cases at an earlier stage in design. LA Noire didn't have a lot of skill development like other games with a greater emphasis on RPG-style progression. There are games, however, that I've worked on that did, and this is a diagram, this is a subsection from a different project I've worked on to illustrate how you can show skills that the player has, progresses and unlocks, but also how you can map those skills to a game's narrative or overall progress. I've blocked out and removed some sections from this, including the storyline titles, and there's only a small set of skills shown. That's an attempt for me not to breach any NDA, so hopefully I've not done that today. What the skills are isn't important, so if you can't read them, don't worry, and that's probably better for me if you can't. But what I'm doing here is mapping the list of skills on the left across onto the game timeline on the right. And I'm thinking about which missions could introduce those skills or leverage them. I found that laying out skill progression to be a really valuable exercise, to visually show where I would be expecting the player to learn those new skills. And it lets me know where we needed to tutorialize if we did. It also helps shape that mission content at the right time to support those skills. It could let me see the pacing of the experience, and it could ensure that for the majority of the game, the player's learning new skills at a good cadence and getting the chance to use those skills that they've acquired at the right frequency, because now designers know what skills are being introduced where. They can put that into their planning to make sure that they're leveraging that. I've spoken a lot about narrative projects because that's what I've done, but I can definitely see how you could replace that narrative timeline just with a level progression or a rank system. You could map out some form of skill tree points and what's available at what time. Again, it comes down to what's useful to communicate to the team, communicating the direction, encouraging feedback, and strengthening alignment. Another example of something you could include in the canvas is trophies, for example, where they're collected through gameplay. This would come much later in production when you're beginning to tackle things like trophies and achievements and where they're triggered. And as with the other elements displayed visually, having an idea across the scope of the full game where the player is likely to gain them is potentially useful for planning distribution. In the example of this section here, I've shown an LA Noire trophy called Roughing, and that was used when you earned it when you used the tackling mini-game, which was the player chasing after a perp and rugby tackling them to the ground. The first time you do this, you're actually taught it in a patrol case, and you earn a bronze trophy. So we know where it is, and we can kind of use that here. It's just an example. And a completely different example of something else you could show is something like a combat flowchart and areas of weakness for a player character. Now, I think when I think about something like this would, for me, be taking a leaf out of the Ubisoft approach. If you were having a milestone or a series of milestones that were focused around a particular mechanic in something like this, like a knife fighting system, then clearly communicating the way that mechanic works could be an approach you take. I think there is a danger here that the flowchart is going into too much detail. You can even see I've not even covered a full flowchart. So you might need to look at how relevant all of that information is. But potentially, if there was progression to the types of weapons, in this case knives, then maybe that's something that you could show instead or in addition to complement this. A design practice that helps support this for me is to approach and always ask yourself, or any of the designers on your team, if there's a way to visualize what you've just written. If you're going to the effort of writing a design, then challenge yourself to ask how you can take that and visualize it to other people who are reading it. As a rule of thumb, consider what your game pillars are. I didn't in the LA Noire diagram, but even just having a list of pillars displayed prominently can be a really useful thing to making sure everyone actually knows what they are. But it's also a useful tool to check against all the other content in that canvas to make sure you're still aligning to what those pillars are and that they're still relevant. Consider the player's progression. That's probably the most useful aspect of the canvas for me. getting that high-level overview of the player journey. Think about the relationships between the features and if there are any that are really important to call out. An example from my diagram might be the laying out of those newspaper collectibles alongside the case progression. That was really useful to see how those two narratives were going to tie together. I should say it would have been really useful. We didn't do that, so we went the hard way. Think about your core gameplay, obviously. Show as many gameplay loops as you can. But the other thing with these is expect your canvases to build over time. Early in production, you might not have all of these elements. You might find that later in production, you can remove some that are now obvious and the team really understands them. Adapting the content to message what's important to the team at any point in time. Investing in methods to improve design communication, increase alignment, and opportunities for feedback doesn't mean that we can stop talking to people, as much as you might wish it did sometimes. Plastering the walls with game canvases is not a way of escaping interacting with the team. I know, I've tried, it doesn't work. Arguably, in my case at least, it actually increases the amount of time you end up engaging with the team, because now they've got a much easier job of consuming that information and telling you how much they think it sucks. But in all seriousness, it's still vitally important to listen to people's ideas. Taking the time to sit and talk to people is a great way to build trust, and that's necessary for people to feel comfortable to share feedback. Visually communicating the design of the game as much as possible really helps support and facilitate those discussions. It frames what you're talking about. And from my experience, that goes a really long way to building alignment, which is ultimately what everyone wants. What I hope I've imparted during this presentation is that while it can be a challenge to get into the routine of visualizing your design and figuring out what's important to communicate, doing so is definitely worthwhile. To maximize the impact, it's critical to promote your design as much as possible and cover the walls with canvases and maps. However, try to not think of yourself as an interior decorator. While it is cool imagery, really think about what you're selling to the team. Where you're placing your imagery is important. Consider how your team move through the office and leverage that. If there's an empty wall but no one ever walks past it, it's not a place for a game canvas. You want high traffic areas. In a similar example, the God of War team put their gameplay pillars over the door that led to the kitchen. Everybody saw it because that's where they were walking every day. It can be a really powerful tool to create and buy in and encourage questions and feedback, and that's invaluable. And again, from my experience, process and vision practices can speed up development. Your team will have a better understanding of what they're making and striving for. And as we learned from Dwayne earlier, it reduces miscommunication. It encourages feedback earlier in the development process, and that saves time and rework. So, what's next? Wargaming Sydney is transitioning as a studio. It's had a long history of being a technology provider, and we're now taking an increasing role in the development of game products. There's work for me to do in how I can effectively keep those teams aligned and inspired on that journey. We work on a lot of prototypes, and I need to find ways to apply a game canvas to quickly generate enough visual direction before we've had time to fully explore what a game might actually be. So in the LA Noire example, it was really easy for me to build something like that. I had a good understanding of what the game is. That was helped by the fact that it was released 8 years ago. But when you think about something like a prototype, we might only be a couple of weeks in, and our focus might only be around proving whether one mechanic is engaging or not. How do you visually convey that? Do you visually convey that? So those are questions that I'm still trying to answer. We also work with a lot of live products, whether in early development to become a live game or to work on a mode within an existing live game, like the Tank Commander mode, which we developed to sit inside the Tank's console product. Either way, there are challenges in how to apply something like a game canvas to a product that either could be expanding for years or where it fits into an existing design that our studio doesn't own. So there's something else that we need to try and figure out. Aside from communicating the vision and the direction around projects, another important area I'm working on is a cultural transformation. I mentioned that the Sydney studio has that pedigree of technology solutions, and we're on a journey to pivoting to take on more game development opportunities. For me, reimagining the studio brand that shows what we're doing is a step towards supporting that transformation. Engaging with teams around the wargaming organization and sharing what we're doing is another part of that journey. There's a lot of challenges ahead. How I can adapt the way I communicate with teams to suit the different styles of projects at varying stages of development, and how I can support our studio's transformation goals. I'm always trying to improve the way that I communicate the design of a project, get people engaged and raise alignment. That's something that I'm particularly passionate about. If anyone wants to connect and continue that conversation, please reach out. I'd be really interested to hear if there's any different approaches or any feedback on anything that you've seen today. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll take questions.
Hey, so I imagine when you started making the GDDs and the design documents early on, when you create a lot of the visual assets, were there any bespoke, like art, concept art, that type of stuff that you requested artists to work on? Because it seems like a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Like, you're trying to tell them what to do, but at that point, I guess they don't know what, you know?
Yeah. So my approach, and so this is just from my perspective, when I start working on design documentation, especially early, I will beg, borrow and steal any imagery that helps convey the message of what I'm trying to get across. So I don't mind stealing anything from the internet if that's going to help people understand what it is I'm trying to make. So very early iterations of any design documentation that I'm creating will often have stolen things in it. That obviously doesn't get published and doesn't go out anywhere. It's just a communication tool. As we then get further into the process, there's more art that can get used, either stuff that's already been built or is being generated. And yes, if you've got anyone on your team that can do some form of concept art or mock stuff up, then that's great. You don't necessarily have to have concept artists. It's great if you do, but they're an expensive item to keep on staff. But anyone that can create something, it's super useful, right? A picture paints 1,000 words. So if you can get it, then do it. But if you don't have anyone that can create that stuff for you, then just find something that matches what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that talk. You had mentioned early on about how it was difficult to convey the changes in the game design document as you were making them. What strategies would you use with a game canvas to demonstrate the changes that are new for someone that's looking at it from day to day?
Yeah, so for me, part of the attraction to something like Game Canvas, the way it works, is that updating it was so much easier. You've got an image file, swapping things out, changing it, it's just quicker. So I would be updating those, and you can have a version number or something on there, or you can just publicize to the team, we're updating these, changing them. There's actually something quite nice about physically walking around and taking things off the wall and putting something back on. It makes it really clear that it's changed. So that is part of the benefit of having an image like that, is that the changes are easier. In the Ubisoft example that I was talking about, scope posters, they're focused around particular milestones. So once that milestone's done, they all get taken down, and then when they do something new, they go up. So you can do that kind of stuff too.
Thank you.
No worries.
Hey, thanks for the talk, really good. So a lot of what your tips and sort of like what you're sort of communicating across I guess there's a certain assumption of scale for like pretty large teams, distributed teams, worldwide teams, that kind of stuff. What kind of advice would you give, say, for like a smaller, like say 10, 15 person total team, or like a distributed online team?
So yes, I guess my experience has tended to be in bigger teams, so that's kind of, I guess, where my first thought goes. But for me, I think once you go beyond 3 or 4 people where you can just turn around and chat to someone behind you, you need a way of tracking what you've decided to do, and you need a way of making sure everyone kind of understands that the direction you're going in. So I think even at that kind of 10 to 15 size, that there's value in visually creating something just so everyone's on the same page. So I would be tempted to still do that. I think in terms of distributed teams, again, in my experience, the visual side helps with that. It's just a little bit easier to make sure people are on the same page. I've used this multi-site, so we had, especially with Warner's, we were working with a group that was in the US, so we were able to share the imagery, and that did help because people kind of had a better understanding of where you were going. That was part of the biggest problem with, although you're creating this Bible, right, this massive design document that's really detailed, not only do you have the hurdle that you need everyone to read it, but they can misinterpret what's written. So sending it around, it's easy to digitally share a copy of a game design document, but for me, the imagery still really helped alleviate some of that. I guess ultimately the only thing is, though, that talking to people and making sure that you're having those conversations is how you really get over it. And the step beyond that is having a build which people can play, and that then also lends to it. But my advice would be still do visual communication as much as possible with diagrams and imagery and artwork, because it just helps, and talk to people as much as possible. If you have to do that via Skype or whatever, then I would do that.
Thanks.
Hi. Have you ever been in a situation where you've I guess a piece of visual documentation was misinterpreted, and in hindsight you felt that depicting it visually might not have been the best way to?
I could lie and say no. Yes, yeah, definitely. Part of the benefit, which is what I was also trying to get across, is that it starts conversations. Because it's there and because people see it and they walk around it, they stop and they look at it and they're like, what the hell does this mean? Like, even if they don't know. And then they'll ask. Or you overhear, or you sit and wait for someone to stop at the diagram and then run up and have a conversation. But the point is that you can engage and have that dialogue, whereas if you're relying on someone reading something, like, you can't walk around the office and hope that someone's flicking through a book, right? But that's the problem, is that the design documentation was less accessible, so people didn't read it as much, and it just didn't encourage that conversation early enough, so you didn't get the chance to correct the miscommunication. When it's so easy to consume and people can ask a question, you can have that dialogue, and you can hopefully solve some of those problems. So yeah, it happens all the time. Everything that you create personally, at least in my experience, everything I create, I have this lens that, it's really obvious what I'm writing or drawing or creating, right? But the truth is that everyone that consumes that runs it through their own filter, and they're going to see something different. As long as you're doing something to make sure you're having that dialogue, that's going to make it a lot easier. Okay, I think we're out of time. Thanks very much.